Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Buckeye Weekly Podcast. I am Tony Gerdeman, here as always with Tom Orr. Tom, how's it going?
Oh, Tony, we are continuing our series on the best Ohio State, like the all-decade Ohio State teams. The question that Isaac McIntyre asked us a few weeks ago that we thought, this would be a good series of shows. So here's the second one of these series. And Tony, I think my big takeaway is the 2000s team was a little upsetting because it's all guys that feel like that guy just finished playing just a few years ago. And it's like, that was in some cases more than 20 years ago. It's like you go to the grocery store or the gas station or whatever, and there's a little sign, the little digital sign that you must be born before this date to buy cigarettes or beer or whatever. And it's like, that's some of that says 2002 now. Like, oh boy, that's the march of time is undefeated, Tony, and so in fact were some of the players on this team. So should be a fun team to go through.
Yes, Tom. In fact, there are children of members of this team on the current Ohio State football team, or at least one child, as far as we know. And yes, it was a very, very, very long time ago. But the galaxy was right here, so that's good. It was close. It was a long time ago, but it was very, very near. So let's get this started. Our all-decade team from the 2000s. We'll start at quarterback. There is one answer, Tom. That answer is
Scott McMullen, Granville's own Scott McMullen. I said on the last show, the first thing you do is you go, okay, who won the Heisman? Great, that guy is on this team. And in that case, that is Troy Smith, who had a really, really... He started his career just the absolute forgotten man. I was working in TV when the class of 2000 recruits showed up, and we did the whole thing where they walked through the into the hotel and all that kind of stuff. Yes, that has been a thing that long, and everyone was rushing over to Justin Zwick. And then the guy who was the last player in the class, who was listed as a quarterback, but let's be honest, he's just an athlete, is whatever. We'll maybe he'll return some kicks at some point, was Troy Smith. And then in 2004, it was not a great season for Ohio State, but then had his real breakout game against Michigan that year, upset Michigan, denied them the outright Big Ten championship with that just incredible performance against Michigan. And then had the agent thing and missed some time at the beginning of the year, and probably the fact that they were shuffling quarterbacks in that Texas game probably kept them from winning that game. And but then really kind of seized that job later on in that 2005 season, and then won the Heisman in 2006, and goes down as the what now would be just sort of an average or maybe slightly below average level of offensive production, but back then it was earth-shattering. Can you believe this offense is so much more efficient and explosive than the 1995, 1998 Ohio State offenses? That was Troy Smith was the trigger man for all of that stuff.
Yeah, they were running a spread offense in 2006, and they'd have four wide, and I think it led to about 2,500 yards passing for Troy Smith. I think 30 touchdowns, 6 interceptions, and basically Jim Tressel was the only guy who could stop Troy Smith that year. Penn State, they had some success, but he was fantastic, and he's the only answer there. Now, in the last show, Tom, I said I went running back and fullback in the 2000s because I did it in the 90s, and then in 2010s I go one running back, 3 wide receivers. You have chosen to go 2 running backs, sans fullback here. Is that correct?
I have. I feel like the fullback kind of phased out midway through the decade, but they weren't really running 3 wides for the whole decade either. So I felt like this was kind of a compromise. We've had a lot of time to think about it since the last time we recorded. So I've decided I'm right on this and you're wrong. So,
then I'll just throw my fullback out there. That would be Jamar Martin, who was the best of that era, and it was a throwback for sure. Special credit to Brandon Joe for being there and being instrumental in the win against Michigan in 2004 as a tailback, whatever. But I just, there are 2 running backs from the 2000s that I have here. And before we get to them, Tom, before I let you get to them, I will say Antonio Pittman deserves some consideration here.
He does. He's one of those really underappreciated Ohio State players because he sort of fell between the two guys that I've got at the running back position, and just sort of, I think, we talked about this a little bit the last time with Corey Stringer is maybe a little underappreciated because he was succeeded by Orlando Pace so quickly that everyone just sort of moved on to Orlando Pace and forgot about Corey Stringer to a certain degree. I think Antonio Pittman's a little bit in that boat too, because he followed a pretty good running back in 2002. There was not a lot of running in 2003, but then Antonio Pittman shows up and was a really, really effective runner for them for a couple of years. And then, but you had the 5-star immediately after him as well. So he just kind of, I think, is one of those really underappreciated Ohio State players. But go back and watch the Fiesta Bowl against Notre Dame. Like, he has the game-sealing run there. He has a big touchdown run against Michigan in 2006, right?
Five.
He had some really, really big moments and was a very, very productive player, and did not have a long NFL career. He's actually a fireman now, but he's someone who I think is not necessarily you mentioned last time you pull the average person, the average Ohio State fan off the street and ask them about their best running back in the 2000s. I think they're going to say two names and not necessarily think of anyone else as a serious contender. I would have him as a contender certainly, but didn't have him as one of my top two.
Yeah, I think the answers here then would be Maurice Clarett and Beanie Wells. And for my money, the first time I saw, watching Maurice Clarett in 2002, he was the best running back in Ohio State history, and in my opinion. And then seeing what Beanie Wells did in 2007, that put him above. But when you look at their respective careers, if you need one guy that you can count on for 1 year, I'm not sure that the answer isn't Antonio Pittman, because Maurice Clarett had injuries, Beanie Wells had injuries. When those two were at their best, sure, and those are the two answers. I just think if you want to be sure that you're going to get 13, 14, 15 games out of somebody, Antonio Pittman might be the correct answer based on the injury history of both of those players.
Yeah, I mean, Clarett in 2002 was just kind of like playing. He had that shoulder thing and was just constantly playing half of games, and you'd see him go out with that right arm dangling again, and he was so incredible when he was out there, but then when he wasn't, boy, that team took a big step back. And then Wells, he had that, what was it, a broken bone in his foot or something right before that UCLA game in 2008 that they had lost that game before they got on the plane. Like, people talk about that the same way they talk about when Keith Byers broke a bone in his foot in the 1985 season. Just, an injury that really derails the whole season because it's such a crucial player for you. So, yeah, I mean, I guess we're kind of defining two different kinds of things here. Who would you have if you needed to rely on this player to win, an entire season versus one game? But I think all three of those guys are absolutely worth having in this conversation as we're talking about the best players at Ohio State in the decade.
And nobody made the first guy miss better than Maurice Clarett. Nobody got to the second level and then planted a defender better than Beanie Wells. So those are the two answers there. I am interested to hear your receivers, because this is, Michael Jenkins, the all-time receiving yardage leader in Ohio State history, was never first team All Big Ten. And he was one of the rare 1,000-yard receivers, especially back then for Ohio State. I think he was the fourth behind Chris Carter, Terry Glenn, and David Boston. And then Paris Campbell became the fifth in 2018. But I don't have Jenkins as one of my two. I instead have Ted Ginn Jr. and Santonio Holmes. And every time I'm doing a list, I initially forget about Santonio Holmes until I see him. I'm like, oh, he has to be there, because he was as good as any Ohio State receiver ever, in my opinion, in terms of just after the catch, playing bigger than his position, was a fantastic punt returner. And I think an underrated guy, but also the number 10 overall draft pick by the Steelers in 2005, maybe in 2006. So I went with Ginn and Holmes as my two, and I Ted Ginn never had 1,000 yards. I think he had like 930 some yards in 2006, and that's just the era he was playing in. So I don't hold him responsible for that, basically.
And I think that's a reasonable case to make. And I certainly would have had Ginn and Holmes as two of my top three. I went with Jenkins and Holmes. I think Michael Jenkins, who was Michael Jenkins playing with as a quarterback and supporting cast on some of those offenses that he was on versus who was Ted Ginn playing on his offenses with, especially towards the end of his career. And Jenkins was super productive. Jenkins was a first round NFL pick, just like the other two guys were. I went with Jenkins because I can get Ted Ginn on this team in another way, two other ways, in fact, and we'll get to those later. Fair. Don't worry. I think, and really, you think about Ted Ginn career highlights. You think of Michael Jenkins career highlights. I say Michael Jenkins career highlights. Everyone right now, 100% of the audience is thinking the same play, and it was one of the most iconic plays in Ohio State history. Plus, he had the productivity, over the years, playing in an offense that was not a very productive offense for long stretches of the season. So I had him there. Santonio Holmes, that's an easy one to me. Ginn was great. Ginn was, certainly one of the most dynamic and explosive players in Ohio State history. Everyone thinks about the Ted Ginn punt return against Michigan, or the Ted Ginn, the long touchdown pass against Notre Dame, or the end around against Notre Dame in that Fiesta Bowl where he picks up like 10 yards of, he gains 10 yards on Doug Daddish in the span of about 3 yards. Like it's one of the funniest gifs. If you ever find that video clip of him running an end around against Notre Dame in the 2006 Fiesta Bowl, him running past Doug Daddish. Like Doug Daddish is running his butt off so far downfield. It's an incredible play, and he's just this prop for Ted Ginn to run around. That is one of my favorite gifs or video clips in Ohio State history. But you look at Ginn, and the game that always that sticks out to me was like the 2004, I think, Michigan State game up in East Lansing, and Ohio State did virtually nothing all game but won because Ted Ginn had one touchdown on an end around, running the ball, hit a touchdown on a punt return, and he had a touchdown where Michigan State, I don't know what Michigan State was thinking, but they're like, Ted Ginn, go ahead and split our safeties. We're going to play him real close to the line for you. And he did, and had a 60-yard, 50-yard touchdown with maybe a minute left to win the game. So, yeah, plenty of great moments for Ted Ginn as a wide receiver, but, like I said, I can get him on the team later.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And Michael Jenkins having Steve Belisario and Craig Krenzel as his quarterbacks, not the best way to go about being productive. That Alamo Bowl for Ted Ginn was also awesome, the different things that he did. Tight end for me, it comes down to two guys, and I went with Ben Hartsock over Jake Ballard. Hartsock has been around. He was a productive receiver, was 30-some catches in 2003, was obviously very much part of the offense in 2002. So I went with him as the 2000s tight end.
Yeah, I think he's one of those guys where, anytime you're talking about tight end productivity, you get the since Ben Hartsock, caveat. It's the biggest Ohio State receiving season for a tight end since Ben Hartsock. We've said that dozens of times over the last few years. And yeah, I think that pretty much answers the question for me. Very productive guy, went on to a nice NFL career, now a broadcaster. I think he's was a pretty easy choice for me. Jake Ballard had some moments. Jake Ballard had a big catch in the 2010 Rose Bowl, 2009 season, but Tony unfortunately happened one day too late to qualify for the 2000s team. So sorry, that's a tough break, but nothing we can do about it.
Tough but fair. The offensive line, I'll go here with the left tackle, Alex Boone, the only All-Big Ten left tackle in the 2000s. There were not a lot of All-Big Ten guys, but I'll say Alex Boone. I do want to give I'll move to left guard real quick and go with Rob Simmons, but also special consideration, shout out to Mike Stafford, the walk-on left guard from the 2002 team, who was one of the best pulling guards in Ohio State history, and was very instrumental in Maurice Clarett getting to that second level and getting through that hole, and was a very valuable member of that team before he got hurt, and then suddenly the running game struggled as well.
Yeah, he's one of those great, Ohio State has these, you have all these incredible players and you're recruiting players from all across the nation, and then you've got a walk-on offensive guard from Upper Arlington who is like one of the, like this secret weapon on this incredible 2002 Ohio State team. So yeah, I have Sims there as well. I had Boone there as well. I think those are good, easy picks. I don't think you're going to get much argument on either of them.
I went with Nick Mangold at center over LaCharles Bentley. Nick Mangold, he didn't start in 2002, but he eventually took the job over, and then he was a starter for the rest of his career. Was an All-American, ends up being a first-rounder. I think that's a very, very solid pick. I went with Alex Stepanovich at right guard, Shane Olivier right tackle. I just think the 2002 offensive line is well represented here. Olivier, winning a national championship. So that was the middle and the right side of my offensive line.
Yeah, and I have LaCharles Bentley / Nick Mangold at center. This is one of these. Don't make me choose, please. They're both so good. I like both of those guys as a pick, and you can take your choice. I mean, LaCharles Bentley is now viewed as this offensive line guru who's taught hundreds of players. He's got an offensive line academy down in Arizona, and he was someone whose NFL career was cut short by injuries, but he was a dominant player at Ohio State. And Mangold, Nick Mangold was a multi-year starter at Ohio State and was a borderline NFL Hall of Famer, I think. So he's but either of those guys, I don't think you can go wrong with either of them. Didn't Stepanovich play center on the 2002 team? He was a guard before that, right?
Yeah, and then I think I'll bring it up. I think he may have moved to guard then in 2003.
When Mangold took over. Yeah, but I mean that whole offensive line, that was one of those, and Olivier too is part of that conversation, where it's just that whole offensive line was just so good, and you had this. You're going up against this Miami defense and this incredible dominant Miami defense that's just completely dominated people all season, and they just get completely held to a stalemate. And Ohio State, the offensive line was just so solid, and I think all of those guys ended up in the NFL. Stepanovich went to the Cardinals, Olivier went to the Chargers, Mangold to the Jets, Rob Sims to the Seahawks. I mean, that was just such a talented offensive line all the way across the deck. And you can win ugly if you can control the line of scrimmage, and they could control the line of scrimmage against pretty much anyone. So that was, I think that's, you could almost take that whole unit and just kind of throw them in there, and I'd be kind of okay with it. But Bentley and Boone, I think, definitely deserve to be talked about in that conversation as well.
It's pretty crazy to see the 2002 starting offensive line listed by Ohio State. Can you tell me the left tackle and the left guard?
As they have it listed?
As they have it listed. Because Rob Sims eventually took over at left tackle, if I recall.
I don't know how they would have it listed.
Ivan Douglas as your left tackle, Adrian Clark as your left guard.
Adrian Clark, okay. Ivan Douglas, I don't think he played left tackle that much that season. Didn't he have blood clots or something? There was some kind of medical something that he had that he missed.
I think they generally go with whoever started the most games.
Okay,
but,
all right, yeah.
I have to go back to all of the box scores and the player participations and clarify. And if it's wrong, I will certainly send an email, sternly worded, to Ohio State. Tom, let's move to defense, because there's some names here that are going to be left off, and also some lack of names on this defensive line as well. So defensive ends, I think, are pretty easy. I went with Will Smith and Vernon Golston. I don't think, both were first rounders. Both were fantastic. Will Smith was the original jack position at Ohio State, because he would play defensive end. He would also stand up and move around like a middle linebacker at times later in his career, just messing with people. Vernon Golston had arguably he was the Bosa's before the Bosa's. He was Chase Young before Chase Young, had 14 sacks in 2006, I think. So I went with those two, which means there's no Darian Scott. There's no Cam Hayward. And I know a lot of people, Cam Hayward played defensive tackle. He was a defensive end at Ohio State, just to clarify for people, because for some reason, obviously he's a big guy. A lot of people always mention him as a defensive tackle, but defensive end at Ohio State, and he's not going to make my list because Will Smith and Vernon Gholston do.
Yeah, and Vernon Gholston's one of those guys who I think the lack of productivity in the NFL, people look at that and go, he wasn't that good. And it's like, well, you should have watched him in college because, man, he was that good in college, especially that last season. When I think of Vernon Gholston, I always think of the great Jim Davidson photo of him standing over Chad Henne, one of the great classics in that genre. But that was one of the most dominant single seasons in Ohio State history. And Will Smith was I think he was a multi-year All-American, and if not, he should have been. He was, again, like that Miami team in 2002, that Ohio State, they were not ready for what that Ohio State defense was bringing that day. And Will Smith, I think, was a big part of that. But yeah, two really dominant ends. And, I don't know if either of them would have made the 2010s team if they were going up against that group. But, that's a pretty stacked team. But yeah, those are two very easy choices for me.
I won't get into it now, but the 2010s, we could spend an hour on the defensive ends alone. And how could you not have this guy on? Well, it's a simple thing of mathematics. There's only 2 allowed, and there's 8 guys. Defensive tackles, that 2002 team is why, and I'll let you have the All-American, is why I have Kenny Peterson as one of my defensive tackles. Now, Darian Scott moved to defensive tackle in 2003 and was really good. Tim Anderson, I think, was the only other defensive tackle that was an All-Big Ten guy in the 2000s for Ohio State. But Kenny Peterson, Miami could not handle him inside. So I went with him, but there's not a lot of guys to pair with the first guy. Yeah,
Quinn Pitcock was an All-American, so I think that's one you just you write that one in pen and you move on. He was out of Piqua, I believe, and just not on the the most memorable Ohio State teams. He was not like the big starter for any of the super memorable Ohio State teams in the 2000s, but a really, really impactful player on the interior of the defensive line. That's one of those spots where you're not going to put up 14 sacks in a season, but you can still dominate a game without putting up monster numbers. And that was kind of how he did. And he was, he got picked by the Colts. I think he might have been a first rounder as well. But, this is just, you're an All-American, you get picked pretty high by the NFL. That's a lot of validation that, yes, you belong on this list. Next to him, I put Tim Anderson. I thought Tim Anderson was really underappreciated. Just someone who just shoot up that middle of that offensive line on that, those dominant early 2000s Ohio State defensive lines. But, I can't really argue with your choice either.
No, and Tim Anderson is perfectly acceptable. And one of those guys that will do whatever you need, and every coach wants one. So I'm good. I'm certainly good with that. Linebackers, to me, I think this is very easy based on the All-Americans. And I have 3 first-teamers. I have A.J. Hawk, I have Matt Wilhelm, and I have 3-time All-American James Laurinaitis. To me, there's some other guys, but they don't compare to the accolades of those 3 guys, the awards of those 3 guys, the impact of those 3 guys. Matt Wilhelm in 2002 was a machine for that team. He was in the backfield. He was calling plays. He was wreaking havoc. James Laurinaitis was, as I said, 3-time All-American, burst onto the scene in 2006 against Texas. I think Brent Musburger made him a star at that point, and he made plays. He was around the football. I'm still not sure I've ever seen a better linebacker at Ohio State than A.J. Hawk. He was complete. Even as a true freshman for the Buckeyes in 2002, had maybe 30 or 40 tackles, an interception for a touchdown, eventually became a part of the defense. And so those 3 guys to me were, I'll stack them up against any decade.
Yeah, those are 3 very easy choices. And what's interesting to me about these guys is I don't remember what Matt Wilhelm's recruiting ranking was, but A.J. Hawk was, I think, a 3-star. James Laurinaitis was, I think, a 3-star. These were not A.J. Hawk was not the big star of his recruiting class at linebacker. He came in the same year as Mike D'Andrea and Bobby Carpenter, and Hawk was just kind of like...
And Mike Kudla.
And Mike Kudla, too. Yep.
Stan White.
Yep. And so he was like this kind of forgotten man. I told the Justin Zwick, Troy Smith story earlier. Mike D'Andrea was the guy we we at the TV station took the helicopter up to Avon Lake to go to Mike DeAndrea's signing day. I don't know that we covered AJ Hawk's signing day that year, even though it was down in Centerville. I mean, it's just that is what that team, what that recruiting class was. DeAndrea was the superstar in the making, and then just got derailed by injuries. And Hawk was just a football player. And James Laurinaitis, same thing, just an incredible football player. Wilhelm was, really the guy in the middle in that 2002 defense. That first drive comes in, stuffs Willis McGahee, does the diamond cutter that Willis McGahee did, and it was like, oh, they came to play tonight. And those three, those are the same thing I had. I just thought it was very interesting that you look all these guys, all these incredible recruits that Ohio State had, and it's like a bunch of 3 stars. And I don't remember what Matt Wilhelm was coming out of high school, but I don't know that they had recruiting services when Matt Wilhelm came out of high school. But yeah, it's interesting to me that those guys came with so little hype and turned into such great players.
Matt Wilhelm, 15 tackles for loss in 2000. And then in 2002 had 19 and a half. Just a machine, as I said. Corners, Tom, I'm going to give you 2. And I'm going to feel pretty good about them, and I'll take them maybe against anybody. Chris Gamble and Malcolm Jenkins, I'm set. I don't need to say any more. I'll sit and listen.
Yeah, I think you probably got it there. I thought about Ashton Yabodi too. He was really good as a corner, but Chris Gamble, just such impactful plays. Just when you needed a play, when you needed to, when the offense wasn't doing anything against Penn State, Chris Gamble was there to make a play on the defensive side of the ball. When you needed to get the game-sealing interception against Cincinnati. He had a kick return in the Cincinnati game. No, it was Will Allen had the game-sealing interception against Cincinnati. But
Gamble had one in the end zone against Cincinnati.
Gamble had one in the end zone late in the game. I don't think it was like the last play of the game or anything. But yeah, I mean, it's just he had the big plays. I think you got to give him a little bonus for playing both ways. But yeah, came to Ohio State as a wide receiver, turned into a first-round pick as a corner. Yeah, I think he's a great choice there. One of the single greatest, just pure athletes in Ohio State history. That is, it was just kind of like, well, we need a corner. Okay, and just went out and turned into one of the most dominant players in the country at that position, just basically overnight. That's one of those things it was a big story back then. I can't even imagine what kind of story it would be now if it, you had a player do that. If, this year, Carnell Tate just gets moved to corner and immediately turns into one of the most dominant players in the country. I think people's heads would explode.
Yeah, I think these 2 corners may be the most clutch corners in Ohio State in the last 3 decades. Because Malcolm Jenkins would have a pick 6 every year against Penn State. Like he made plays. He was always around the ball. So those 2 guys were incredible. The safeties here, there's one easy answer. And I'll throw Mike Doss out there. He's 3-time All-American. I always have a special place in my heart for Will Allen, the way how valuable he was in 2002, and then he was an All-American in 2003. But I think the right answer here is Dante Whitner.
Yeah, I guess. I mean,
unless you do a free safety, strong safety, then Will Allen is perfect.
Yeah, I think Will Allen is my choice here. Just because, I mean, Dante Whitner was a great player, and he was, I think, a top 10 pick for the Bills. If not, it was a top 15 pick for the Bills. But man, Will Allen, just the most. He talked about how clutch the corners were. How many games did Will Allen win with a play, right at the gun? The interception against Michigan in 2002. He had the tackle at the goal line on T.A. McClendon against North Carolina State in 2003. I mean, like these incredible down to the last play games where, Ohio State is on, either going to win or lose based on what Will Allen does right here. And he just seemed to always come up big. I'm not going to fight you on Dante Whitner, but man, I think when I think of Ohio State safety 2000s, I think Mike Doss and I think Will Allen.
I think Dante Whitner would be a great nickel kind of, because he was fantastic at blowing up screens and that, but I think he might be a little redundant with Mike Doss in terms of the strong safety guy. Will Allen, they would need a deep guy, and I have no problem with that because we talk about last line of defenses, we talk about cleaners and sweepers, like that was Will Allen. Kickers here, I'm personally going with Mike Nugent and Andy Groom. Andy Groom, I know BJ Sander won the Ray Guy, but Andy Groom was Ray Guy in 2002. That guy was incredible. Mike Nugent, not the kicker of the 90s, not very good in the 90s, much better in the 2000s.
Yeah, Nugent had the 2001 season where he had looked awful. Looked like where did they get this guy? And then just 2002 just showed up and just was automatic for the next 3 years. Was he a first rounder by the Jets? He got picked early, but second rounder by the Jets. Okay. Just got picked. That tells you exactly how dominant he was in college. And, we've talked about clutch. We've talked about, no one was more clutch than Mike Nugent. Just, I always think back to not the greatest season, not the greatest game, but the 55-yarder at the gun against Marshall in 2004. It was just one of those. He's running out there, and everyone in the stadium is going, never in doubt. Just go ahead and get your car keys out. He's going to hit it, and he did. Yeah, he was clutch. Groom was incredible. One of my favorite stories from the 2002 season was, after the Fiesta Bowl, you remember they ran that fake field goal, and it was like Groom and Nugent running the option. And, after the game, they were talking, like Groom was basically saying, hey, if I got one more block, I was gone. And Nugent's going, if he had pitched to me, I was gone. And just, it's a funny story now because they won the game. That could have been very bad had they not won the game. But it was, those were two guys where if you want to play trestle ball, you've got to really be just perfect at the margins. You can't miss field goals if you're going to try and win every game by a field goal. You have to be able to down those punts inside the 5-yard line if you're going to try and punt and play field position. And those were guys who let Jim Tressel play trestle ball and ended up 14-0.
Yeah, my mistake. I was thinking Mike Nugent was like a true freshman in '99 when he was kicking the ball into the tunnel, but that was later in his career, or he started later than that, I should say. Anyway, the kickoff return, punt return guy, I'm going to go with the same guy, and I'm going to go with Ted Ginn Jr., who had 4 punt returns as a true freshman in 2004. Only finished with 2, I think, kickoff returns in his career at Ohio State, which is still ties the school record, 2 career kickoff returns. The most the most underutilized offensive player in Ohio State football history, Ted Ginn Jr., my kick and my punt returner.
Yeah, this is, I think, one of the easiest choices you could have on any of these teams at any position where, Ohio State has not run a kickoff back for a touchdown since 2010, right? The 2010 Michigan game was the last time they ran a kickoff back for a touchdown. And when Ted Ginn was back there, every time the ball went in there, like, oh, this is definitely going to go. And like you said, I think he had one against Indiana and one against Minnesota, I think. But, punt returns, you said 4 punt return touchdowns?
In 2004.
Oh, in 2004. Okay, yeah. He was just incredible. That's punt returns. When was Ohio State hasn't returned a punt for a touchdown since 2014, right? Was that Jalen Marshall against Indiana was the last time they returned a punt for a touchdown, I believe? So
yeah,
you've gone basically a decade without doing it, and Ted Ginn did it 6 times in 3 years. That's that is a remarkably talented guy who just was so much better at those 2 things. And, like you said, boy, you put him on a Ryan Day era offense, or you just, you any kind of, even some of the Urban Meyer offenses, you put him on anytime since Ryan Day got there. How about that? You put him on the team with, Justin Fields in 2019, 2020, like, boy, oh boy, what could that guy do? That feels like you put him out there, that swings the Clemson game. You put him out there, you're so dominant. And you look at the 2006 season, the way that ended with him returning a kickoff for a touchdown against Florida and then breaking a bone in his foot. And that was just kind of the end of that game. Like, oh, well, we had our whole game plan based around him and now he's not here. So, now what? And there was no answer.
One of my favorite stats still is that freshman year, He returned 15 punts. He averaged 25.6 yards per punt return. That is the most and the best average in school history for a season. The second most is 18.7 yards per return. So he's like 7 yards better than what used to be the best of all time, and he was incredible. Absolutely. So there you go. The Ohio State football team of the 2000s, the aughts, if you will, as they are called, and a lot of good guys there, a lot of first rounders, and some very talented guys. And I'm interested to see how they fare moving forward when we start to divvy things up and compare and contrast. But that will do it for this episode. Want to thank you all for joining us. I hope you're enjoying the series. We still have a little bit more to go. Move it into modern times. Enough of this black and white stuff. So feel free to join us at BuckeyeHuddle.com. Hit us up on the message board. Let us know what you think. Also, feel free to rate and review this at all of your podcast platforms of choice. And if you're watching this on YouTube, go ahead and hit the thumbs up. Give us a like. Go ahead and subscribe if you haven't. Hit the bell to be notified. Find us however you can and tell us what you think. So thank you all for tuning in, and we'll talk to you guys later.